How can small, unnoticed habits slowly reshape an entire way of life? What keeps a society united? Is it shared values, wise leadership, or the discipline of education? And if change is inevitable, how can it happen without losing the balance that holds everything together? Hello, friends, and welcome back to the part 13 of Aristotle's Politics. Today, we are continuing to explore Book 5. So, after tracing the roots of conflict and instability, Aristotle now turns to prevention. He explains how balance is preserved when people avoid arrogance, when leaders understand balance and proportion, and when education prepares citizens to live in harmony with their community's character. If you enjoy these episodes, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or follow and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can find this show on all major platforms. And for daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. And if you missed the earlier episodes, check them out as they all connect together. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. I've had one recently with Roman Yampolsky on AI and simulation theory. I also had one with Massimo Pigliucci on Stoicism and Stephen Hicks on Enlightenment. Check them out if you're interested. Now back to Aristotle. After talking extensively about democracies and oligarchies in the previous chapter, Aristotle now turns his attention to aristocracy. So the aristocracy, the regime that is supposed to be ruled by the best, the most virtuous people. And the irony he exposes here is actually powerful. So even the rule of the best can decay because human nature always finds a way to test virtue. So let's take a pause here and remind ourselves what aristocracy actually means. Uh, like oligarchy, it is a system ruled by the few, but unlike oligarchy, those few are chosen for their virtue, not their wealth or property. So at least in theory, this is the case. Virtue over wealth, or excellence over privilege. It doesn't necessarily mean that engaging in wealth is immoral, but it does mean that having wealth or property does not automatically qualify you to participate in decision making and deliberation of the city. Next question is, what makes aristocracies fall apart? Remember, in the previous part, we discussed how oligarchies and democracies might face the same issue. So now Aristotle is turning the attention to aristocracies. What makes aristocracies fall apart? What causes their decline? Aristotle gives few reasons. Reason number one, aristocracies collapse when too many people believe they are more virtuous than the ones in power. When those who think they deserve to rule because of their education, their bravery, their moral excellence, when these people are excluded or dishonored, resentment begins to grow. It is like a society full of philosopher kings, where everyone thinks they are the real king. They are the philosopher king that deserves to participate in decision making. Reason number two, conflict arises when strong and virtuous individuals, Aristotle calls them people of manly character, are kept out of decision making and deliberation in the city. These are people with energy, ambition, and pride. So Aristotle says that if you exclude these people, they won't just sit quietly. They'll find another way to assert themselves, and that's how downfall begins. Reason number three, aristocracy can collapse when a single person of outstanding virtue decides to take things too far. When one extraordinary individual, convinced of their superiority, believes the city would be better off under their leadership alone, that's when aristocracy starts mutating into monarchy, which Aristotle saw as a more tolerable version, or tyranny, which Aristotle saw as the most extreme decline. Then Aristotle jumps into making comparisons between aristocracy and his most favorite type of regime, at least in practice rather than in theory, called polity. So check out part 11 of this series if you want to deep dive into what polity is and how it comes to being and why Aristotle believes it is the most preferable and most practical arrangement for the most cities. He says that polities, those mixed constitutions balancing the interests of the rich and poor, tend to be more stable than aristocracies. Why? Because in a polity, the many share in decision making, as we explored in the previous episodes in more detailed format. So consensus is wider, resentment is smaller. Yes, aristocracy looks better on paper because few virtuous philosopher kings participate in the decision making and deliberation. So everything is faster, everything is efficient, people know whom to turn for advice, etc. But polity survives better in practice because many people are involved. There is more consensus in terms of decision making. He also says something subtle but important. So many people can't tell the difference between aristocracy and oligarchy. Both are ruled by the few people, a number of people, or by the small number of people grouped together. Both often overlap in practice, at least from the perspective of common citizen. And when that happens, when people stop seeing virtue and start seeing privilege, Aristotle says, then aristocracy slides into oligarchy, ruled by wealth instead of wisdom. He says something similar happened in Sparta, for example. So Sparta was supposed to be an aristocracy, not an ideal one, but definitely not an oligarchy. Its rulers were chosen for military excellence, courage, and discipline. At least that was the foundational thought behind the establishment of Spartan community, Spartan city. But Aristotle says over time, wealth began to matter more than the virtue. And when that shift happened, when military virtue was replaced by material luxury, Sparta lost the very soul of its regime. And ultimately, this is what caused the downfall of Sparta. It does not mean that Aristotle really admired Spartan regime. And if you watched or listened to the part 2 of this series, Aristotle famously observed that Spartans were so focused on military discipline that they neglected the art of leisure. And the leisure is one of the key factors that leads to cultivation of moral character and development of civic virtues, according to Aristotle. But still, the example that we gave is good comparison on how priorities can change from founding the city on military virtue versus this eventually turning into oligarchy, where wealth and property is more important than military discipline. Having argued all of these points, then Aristotle summarizes all these dynamics with the idea that once a system abandons its founding principle, even a little, it sets off a chain reaction. So the same way the body weakens when it stops exercising the muscles that keep it healthy, a regime weakens when it stops practicing the values that once defined it. That is basically all regarding chapter 7. So brief summary of the main points raised by Aristotle in this chapter that we can go through is: number 1, aristocracy, even though better than polity in theory, according to Aristotle, is still not immune from instability. Number 2, many people can tell difference between aristocracy and oligarchy, since both are arrangements where only very few people share in power and decision making. And therefore, it is easy for people to mistake aristocracy as oligarchy, and this will cause instability, according to Aristotle. Finally, number 3, virtue is subjective. There will be a lot of people claiming that they are virtuous. So argument that only virtuous few people should rule might not be practical for most cities. Whereas you don't have that problem in polity, because in polity, everyone somehow contributes to shaping the life of the city. That is all about the aristocracy. After spending several chapters explaining how systems might be out of shape, in chapter 8, Aristotle flips the question. So how do you preserve them? How do you keep a city stable? And here, Aristotle puts on his psychologist hat and says that human beings notice big changes, but they rarely notice small ones. When something changes all at once, people react. They might resist, they might panic, they fight back. But when change happens slowly, gradually, bit by bit, nobody notices. And then one day you wake up and realize everything has shifted. Aristotle says the same logic applies to societal structures as well. And the task of the governor or ruler is to notice these changes and mitigate them to preserve the society. Then he gets very practical. He starts giving advice to those guiding communities in his time on how they can preserve their system. An interesting detail here. Remember, Aristotle was the tutor of Alexander the Great. And I wonder whether he passed these ideas to him as well. But it was not ultimately successful, yeah, because as we know, the empire of Alexander collapsed right after his death. So interesting detail here, historical detail. But anyway, back to advice for rulers. Since for now this is a philosophy channel, not a history channel, but maybe in the future we will also explore some historical concepts. Advice number 1. Any arrangement survives when those who hold decision-making power do not alienate those who don't. So in simple terms, if you are in charge, don't humiliate those who are not. Every system, Aristotle says, can survive if the ruling side respects those left out. Advice number 2. Aristotle says equality is just only among people who are equal in virtue. If two people have similar education and character, then they should share equally in rule. One should not triumph over the other. So that's how you prevent resentment between powerful but morally virtuous people from turning against each other. Think about, for example, how Emperor Augustus and Mark Antony turned against one another in the ancient Rome after the Civil War. Advice number 3, he says something that sounds almost Machiavellian, centuries before Machiavelli existed. So he says fear preserves systems. That awareness that losing something might have consequences that you want to avoid. So if people lose that fear, then they become careless regarding what ultimately happens in the city. Advice number 4. Aristotle warns against letting one person or one group become too powerful in any social setting, not necessarily just cities, politics. When rewards and recognition pile up on one person, it creates jealousy and suspicion. So it's better, he says, to distribute honors and rewards slowly in small doses. Give everyone just enough to feel valued, but never enough to feel very special. Let's think about an example from our modern lives for a second. Let's see if that applies. Imagine you own a company, okay, and you hire 2 workers. And after a year of experiment, now it's time for performance evaluation and salary evaluation. One has performed in very average way, gets things done, but doesn't do anything special. But the another one really has shaped everything and outperformed the average. In that situation, Aristotle would say that if you want to evaluate salaries in this specific scenario, for example, instead of ignoring average worker with 0% salary increase and giving 100% salary increase, meaning doubling it for outstanding person, instead do it in more balanced way and more proportionate format. For example, give the average worker 5% salary increase, an outstanding person 10% salary increase. So by doing this, you reduce the chance of average worker becoming too unhappy and having a sense of inequality. On the other hand, you reduce the chance of person who has performed better feeling too special, but still feeling valued as they get higher salary increase than the average worker. This might not sound fair, and of course, which one is fair ultimately depends on your sense of justice and what you hold as higher value. Whether equality and social harmony is more important to you or whether giving everyone what they deserve. But the goal here is the preservation of the social system, not whether rewards are distributed fairly. And this is what Aristotle is aiming at. How do you design the system of incentives where social harmony, in this case, the harmony between two different employees in the company, in this specific setting, uh, will be preserved? And actually, this is how most companies operate today. For example, no one gets their salary doubled overnight. Moving on to the next advice that Aristotle has for the governors. Advice number 5: create clear, codified, impersonal laws. If rules are vague, they are very ambiguous, favoritism might take over, Aristotle says. So codify everything, he says, to make favoritism expensive and fairness cheap. Advice number 6, which I find fascinating the most out of all these points. He gives an advice to the rulers that they should design offices so that it is impossible to gain private profit from public power. Because once people see that holding office brings money, they will stop caring about virtue or their own private lives and they will start chasing positions. But if you make offices unprofitable, if you design them so that no one can get rich from power, people will stay focused on their private lives. They'll build businesses, raise families, improve their skills, their craft, whatever that they are doing, whatever they are naturally good at. And naturally, this will strengthen the economy. Poor people will lift themselves out of poverty, not by chasing positions, but actually creating something using their skills. And then they will have time to cultivate their character, their education, and virtues. And as a result, city will become more virtuous. That is all about chapter 8. Let's go over a brief summary of the main points raised by Aristotle in this chapter. This was mainly the section where Aristotle tried to give practical advice to the governors of his time regarding the preservation of their systems. Governors should not alienate those who do not hold power. Second, equality should be preserved among people who are equal in virtue. A sense of caution preserves systems. If people believe that making certain choices have certain consequences, they will think twice before taking an action. And as a result, they will not be careless about city's direction. Preserve social harmony in any social setting. One person should not feel too powerful or influential, according to Aristotle. Next, there should be clear and impersonal laws. And finally, offices should be designed in a way that it is impossible or very costly to profit off of them. So that's basically the advice that Aristotle has for the governors of his time. How many of them do you think are still relevant for today? Comment them down below in the video. Moving on to the chapter 9. In chapter 9, Aristotle turns the attention into completely different subject all of a sudden in a very Aristotelian fashion. Because remember, this Aristotle's Politics, just like other books of his, was not meant to be published. So this is most likely the collection of notes preserved by one of his students during the lecture that later compiled into one complete book. That's why sometimes you see this logical irregularities between different chapters, different ideas, straight jumping from one idea to other without clear transition. That's the nature of the book that we are exploring. But anyways, in chapter 9, Aristotle turns the attention into completely different subject now. Personal virtues of those who take part in deliberation and decision making, personal qualities, personal characteristics of people that share power. Anyone who holds authority, he says, should have 3 essential qualities. First, loyalty to the system they are in. Second, competence, meaning the actual skills to do the job. And third, according to Aristotle, this is the most important part, sense of virtue and justice, the moral character to use power rightly and in a responsible way. And on the point 3, Aristotle surprisingly says that virtue, in this case, in the case of governorship, is relative to the regime. It's not universal. Whereas if you want to explore personal ethics as described by Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics, there he argues that's universal. But in the case of politics, in the case of cities, deliberation, decision making, he makes a surprising turn. He says that Virtue is relative to the regime. So justice will look different depending on the type of societal structure you're living in. That means a good governor in one context might not be a good governor in another. But the golden rule still remains. Rulers should always align their private lives with the moral code of their city. But honestly, anyone who knows about human beings will tell at this point that it is really rare to find one person that holds all these three characteristics. Person who is loyal, has competence, and also highly moral. However, we define this morality here. But in this case, Aristotle refers to the morality in relation to the system. So several questions naturally arise at this point. What if you can find all three qualities in one person? What if someone is highly skilled but not moral, or virtuous but incompetent? Which one do you choose? If you had to disregard one quality, which one would you choose to disregard in real life situation? Aristotle says it depends on the role. So, for example, if you're choosing a general, experience matters more than moral perfection, he says, because war needs skill. But if you're choosing a guardian of public funds, character and virtue matters more than competence, because money tempts everyone. But the role of that person would simply be the preservation of the funds, making sure that funds are preserved for the public use, rather than having, let's say, mathematical skills in understanding how to create wealth, how to create models for creating wealth, for example. Okay, so we have three essentials, yes, three essential qualities of governors, according to Aristotle: loyalty, competence, and virtue. You might ask, why do you need virtue if you are competent and loyal? Aristotle says even the most skilled and loyal person can lack self control. So a governor should still be someone that has character, that can make right calls, just decisions in crucial times. And it is crucial that they have strong sense of justice, strong sense of serving community, serving the society. And that's where the importance of education comes in Aristotelian ethics. Not education in general, but education relative to the regime. He says it is pointless to have the best laws in the world if citizens aren't trained to live by them. If the city is democratic, people should be raised with habits that sustain democracy, Aristotle says. If it is oligarchic, then with the habits that sustain order and responsibility, for example. Because just as individuals collapse without self discipline, cities might also collapse without civic education. Then Aristotle starts talking extensively about the topics that we covered already, which I'm not going to go in depth because they are essentially Aristotle repeating the same things that we also explored before about polity, middle class, monarchies, etc. If you want to explore these ideas further, check out the earlier episodes, previous parts of this series, because we explore all these concepts in more detail there. Still, there are a couple of things to note here. After talking a lot about human psychology and power relations in practice, Aristotle still goes back to his original classification of systems and reiterates that monarchy, that is the rule of the one virtuous leader for the benefit of the community, is still the best in theory. Even though in the previous chapters he admitted that polity would be the most preferable given all the imperfections of the human nature. However, there is something interesting to note here. He once again links it to what he calls good old nostalgic times where cities were ruled by ancient and noble kings who were virtuous and cared about people. He says that in his own time, which is the 4th century BC in ancient Greece, he says that these true forms of natural kingship declined rapidly. So the world no longer produced men so outstanding in virtue that others would follow them willingly. What remained were monarchs ruling through force, kings only in name. It is interesting to think, again, linking it back to his student, it's interesting to think what Alexander the Great would think about this observation. I sometimes wonder whether he's criticizing Alexander or got dissatisfied with his role in the future, or whether there was some drama involved. Perhaps this can be a focus for another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these episodes, make sure to like and subscribe in YouTube or follow and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can find this show on all major platforms. And for daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. And if you missed the earlier episodes, go check out earlier episodes also, because the concepts and categories and theories that I have covered here builds upon the discussions that we've had in the previous chapters. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. I've had one recently with Roman Yampolsky on AI and simulation theory, with Massimo Pigliucci on Stoicism, and Stephen Hicks on Enlightenment. Check them out if you're interested. Until the next time, bye.